So, where did we leave off? Ah, yes, that's right. Eventually, the Egyptians started expanding again in the 10th century BC, and the Assyrians, in response to essentially being colonized by the Arameans, expanded again for the first time in over a century and expelled the Arameans from their newly acquired territory. In the 9th century BC, they conquered much more, and the kingdom of Edom gained independence from the kingdom of Judah. While all this was going on, Babylon had yet to recover from the Bronze Age collapse. Next, the Chaldeans migrated in. Since Babylon had been so depopulated, the Chaldeans became synonymous with the inhabitants of Babylon, and Tyre rose to become the wealthiest and most powerful Phoenician city-state, particularly from 969 to 936 BC. Later on, in 887 to 856 BC, Tyre expanded its territory as far north as Beirut and into part of Cyprus. This unusual act of aggression was the closest the Phoenicians ever came to forming a unitary territorial state. Subsequently, in 858 BC, the Assyrians began a series of campaigns against neighboring states. The Phoenician city-states fell under Assyria's rule, forced to pay heavy tribute in money, goods, and natural resources. Initially, they were not annexed outright. They remained in a state of vassalage, subordinate to the Assyrians, but allowed a certain degree of freedom. Egypt was taken over by the Kushite kingdom. Assyria conquered Babylon and the kingdom of Israel, destroying it in the process, and the population deported Assyrian military policy, resulting in the so-called Lost 10 Tribes of Israel. While engaging in regular warfare against the Urartu, and ancient Greece finally became recognizable, the many Greek city-states began setting up colonies throughout the Mediterranean and Black Seas. The two most powerful city-states, Athens and Sparta, were the ones who engaged in colonization the least, since they had little need to colonize. For the same reason why they were the most powerful cities, they had the most flat land. Sparta conquered the areas nearest to it and ruled like a modern military dictatorship. The Athenians, meanwhile, were led by aristocrats who quarreled with each other and made promises of better life for all, used in common support to forcefully seize power and then change nothing, except keep down a different aristocrat who would try to do the same thing to him. Oftentimes, peasants would try to seize power instead of an aristocrat. Eventually, this cycle of the suppressed peasants negotiating with the aristocracy created Greek democracy, and the Medes moved from modern-day Afghanistan into the Iranian plateau. In the intervening time in southern Illyria, organized states were forming earlier than in other areas of the Balkans. The oldest known state which can be discussed about from ancient sources is that of the Encheli, which was born in the 8th century BC and engaged in war with the northern Greeks very often. The king of Judah formed an alliance with Egypt and made a stand against Assyria by refusing to pay tribute. In return, Assyria attacked the fortified cities of Judah, and Judah paid 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold to Assyria, weakening the kingdom greatly and causing it to become a vassal of Assyria sometime from 687 to 642 BC, and in 687 or 686 to 643 to 642 BC, Cushitic Egypt made a big mistake by starting a war with Assyria, and Assyria conquered Egypt in this war by 663 BC. The Enchele held dominance for 2 centuries until their state crumbled from the start of the 6th century BC. After the Enchele, the Tolanti formed their own state in the 7th century BC. In 627 BC, the Assyrian Empire descended into a prolonged and brutal series of civil wars involving 3 rival kings, and Egypt's 26th dynasty, which had been installed by the Assyrians as a vassal, quietly detached itself from Assyria, although it was careful to retain friendly relations. 2 peoples from modern-day Ukraine called the Scythians and Cimmerians took advantage of the bitter fighting among the Assyrians to raid Assyrian colonies, ravaging parts of Asia Minor and the Caucasus, where the vassal kings of Urartu and Lydia begged their Assyrian overlord for help in vain. They also raided the Levant into Egypt. The Chaldean and Babylonians led the Medes and other Iranic peoples with the aid of previous Assyrian destruction of the Elamites of ancient Iran, also took advantage of the upheavals in Assyria to coalesce into the Neo-Babylonian and Median empires, absorbing the remnants of the pre-Iranic Elamites of southern Iran, with the Medes conquering the Urartu, another vassal of Assyria. In an alliance with the Scythians and Cimmerians, launched a surprise attack on a civil war, belligered Assyria in 615 BC, taking modern Kirkuk and Gassar. Despite the sorely depleted state of Assyria, bitter fighting ensued throughout 614 BC. The Medes continued to gradually make hard-fought inroads into Assyria itself, with the Neo-Assyrian Empire disintegrating to the east and Egypt to the west, still recovering from Assyrian rule. Judah could govern itself for the time being without foreign intervention. However, in the spring of 609 BC, Egypt had a sizable army led up to the Euphrates to aid the Assyrians, was blocked by the Judean army, who may have considered that the Assyrians and Egyptians were weakened by the death of a pharaoh only a year prior, attempted to block the advance at Megiddo, where a fierce battle was fought and the king of Judah was killed. Egypt then joined forces with the Assyrians, and their combined forces failed to accomplish anything. The pharaoh retreated back to northern Syria. The event also marked the disintegration of the Assyrian Empire. On his return march to Egypt, the pharaoh found out that a man named Jehoahaz had been selected to succeed the previous king of Judah. The pharaoh deposed Jehoahaz, who had been king for only 3 months, and replaced him with his older brother, Jehoiakim. Egypt imposed on Judah a levy of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. The pharaoh then took Jehoahaz back to Egypt as his prisoner, never to return. Jehoiakim ruled originally as a vassal of the Egyptians by paying heavy tribute. However, when the Egyptians were defeated by the Babylonians in 605 BC, Jehoiakim changed allegiances to pay tribute to Babylon. In 601 BC, Babylon attempted to invade Egypt but was repulsed with heavy losses. The failure led to numerous rebellions among the states of the Levant that owed allegiance to Babylon. Jehoiakim also stopped paying tribute to Babylon and took a pro-Egyptian position. The Babylonians soon dealt with the rebellions, according to the Babylonian Chronicles. After invading the land of Hatti in 599 BC, he laid siege to Jerusalem. Jehoiakim died in 598 BC during the siege and was succeeded by his son Jeconiah at an age of either 8 or 18. The city fell about 3 months later. On March 16th, 597 BC, the Babylonians pillaged both Jerusalem and the temple and carted all of his spoils to Babylon. Jeconiah and his court and other prominent citizens and craftsmen, along with a sizable portion of the Jewish population of Judah, numbering about 10,000, were deported from the land and dispersed throughout the Babylonian Empire. Babylon appointed Jehoiakim's brother, the king of the reduced kingdom, who was made a tributary of Babylon. Sometime in the early 6th century, 3 descendants of a mighty Dorian Greek fighter were exiled from Argos to Macedonia and gradually garnered enough support to conquer or unite the various Macedonian tribes. Around 563 BC, they created a small kingdom around the city of Aigai and began pushing out Thracian tribes. As all this was happening, the Medes were pushing the Scythians out of the Middle East and into the Balkans. In the interim, in Illyria, the Autariatan communities unified into a single political entity that can be called with the collective name Autoriate in the period 6th to 4th centuries BC. In 553 BC, one of the tribes that recognized Median overlordship rebelled against the Medes and eventually conquered the last Median territory by 560 BC. That tribe became the Persian Empire. By 530 BC, the Persians had conquered the Babylonian Empire as well. And by 524 BC, Egypt would also succumb to the conquest of the Persians. The Achaemenid Empire, also known as the First Persian Empire would also go on to take some parts of Greece. Before it conquered the Greek city-state of Miletus, the most powerful Greek city-state, Athens, aided it but failed. For the next 20 years, the Persians would attempt to conquer Athens and Sparta but failed. As the Persians appeared in Thrace to fight the Greeks, they stimulated trade to the Thracians. Slightly later, by 510 BC, the Persians had led a campaign to subdue the Scythians in the central Balkans. The Macedonians, being fed up with all the violence the Persians brought near them, paid tribute to the Persians to stop fighting near them. Becoming a vassal of the Achaemenid Empire, and in the aftermath of the Persian failure in Greece, the Odrysae tribe filled the vacuum left by the Persian retreat and became the Odrysian tribal kingdom. Around 477 BC, Athens founded a maritime union, becoming the center of Hellas, with over 150 of the Greek city-states contributing to the maintenance and funding of a common army and navy. Over time, this would cause Sparta and its allies, which included Macedonia, to grow envious of the Athenian-led city-state confederacy. In 431 BC, they invaded Athens and its allies. During the early stages of this war, several cities of Chalcidice broke away from the Athenian-dominated faction. The inhabitants of these cities abandoned them and moved to Olynthos in an act of Sinoicism, forming a single state and adopting the demonym Chalcidians. The other city-states gradually surrendered to the Spartan-led alliance, and Athens agreed on a humiliating peace treaty. Following this, Macedonia gradually became Hellenized, and in 424 BC, the Odrysian kingdom, in an attempt to unite all the Thracian tribes, attacked another Thracian tribe called the Triballi to conquer them, and failed, then were pushed to the east by the invading Autoriatae. Later on, at the end of the 5th century BC and beginning of the 4th, the Triballi invaded the Odrysian kingdom, weakening its hierarchy so much that this allowed it to plunge into a civil war. In 389 BC, an Athenian general helped an Odrysian king called Cotys consolidate his power in a shadow of what the Odrysian kingdom used to be. In spite of all this, the relationship between Athens and the Odrysian kingdom rapidly deteriorated, and by the early 370s, a number of cities and islands had formed a second Athenian confederacy intended to protect themselves from Odrysia and supported the Triballi. Then later on, in the early mid-4th century BC, some Illyrian tribes and the Chalcidian League invaded Macedonia, and not only did Macedonia repel them, but completely conquer them too. By 364 BC, eventually, the tensions between Athens and Odrysia escalated into an inconclusive war that ended in a peace treaty, where they declared each other allies. In 361 BC, however, peace would not last, as the next year, in 360 BC, some Athenian dudes killed Cotys, and the kingdom was divided among his 3 sons. In the 350s, one of the kingdoms that came out of the Odrysian kingdom allied himself with some Illyrians, and the Macedonian king, Philip II, conquered those Illyrians. Then in 339 BC, he was returning from an expedition, this time against the Scythians. The Triballi refused to allow him to pass the Haemus unless they received a share of the loot. Hostilities took place in which Philip was defeated and wounded by a spear in his right thigh. On the bright side for Philip II, by the time of his death in 336 BC, he had conquered all of the former Odrysian kingdoms and the Athenian-led alliance. When he died, his son Alexander the Great took over and passed through the lands of the Odrysians in 335 to 334 BC, crossed the Haemus ranges, and after 3 encounters defeated and drove the Triballians to the junction of Laginus at the Danube. 3,000 Triballi were killed, the rest fled. Their king took refuge on the Danubian island of however you pronounce that, where most of the remnants of the defeated Thracians were exiled. The successful Macedonian attacks terrorized the tribes around the Danube. The autonomous Thracian tribes sent tributes for peace. Alexander was satisfied with his operations and accepted peace. Later in the same year, Alexander invaded the Achaemenid Empire and began a series of campaigns that lasted 10 years. Following the conquest of Anatolia, Alexander broke the power of Persia in a series of decisive battles. He didn't conquer the part of their empire Empire, which used to be the Kingdom of Colchis. But since it severed it from the rest of the Achaemenid Empire, Colchis became independent again, and the descendants of the Urartu became semi-independent as the country Armenia. Alexander the Great would later go on to try his hand in India. That's a story for a different video, since this is only about the Balkans and the Middle East. A year after his conquest of the Persian Empire in 323 BC, Alexander the Great died, and his empire was divided by three of his generals into the Ptolemaic Empire, Seleucid Empire, and Antigonid Empire. And that's where I'm going to end this video. Part 3 will cover up until the end of the Western Roman Empire. If you want Part 3 to be uploaded sooner, try motivating me to work on it faster by subscribing.